what happens to primary representations in pretense play? Well, just to be brief here, what Leslie says is that in pretend representation, the relation between a given representation and reality is suspended or modified. Moreover, Leslie's answer involves a metaphor that is very appropriate for the times we are living, and it is that the representations involved in pretense must somehow be quarantined from other representations. So, if there were no quarantine, the pretense and the non-pretense representation could interact with each other, thus giving rise to conflict and contradiction. Right? This would infect the whole system with contradiction. But by quarantining pretense representations, the psychological unity of the agent is preserved. A similar need arises when trying to make sense of other people's pretense. So the infant must have some way to understand pretending in others, whether other children or her caregivers. So what would such an infant made of a grandma pretending, for example, that a banana is a telephone, if the child could not understand pretense in others? So if the infant were only capable of representing the activity in a literal way, she might be really puzzled by hearing and seeing her grandma talking to a banana. And if the child can't make sense of this, she runs the risk of ending up with very strange beliefs about bananas, or about grandma, or about both of them. But Leslie says that by the end of the second year, most children can understand these situations perfectly well. And he adds that there is a common mechanism at work for quarantining representations in these two cases. It is a mechanism that tags some representations as belonging to the context of pretense, as opposed to serious context. In fact, he thinks that this mechanism must be more informative, so it has to indicate who is pretending what, and how the pretense is related to the actual world. So this is something that the child must know if it is to join in the fun and elaborate on the pretense that, with grandma, for instance, or with other children. And again, infants late in the second year somehow seem to be capable of this. Leslie says that this single mechanism of quarantining explains the ability to pretend and the ability to understand pretense in others. He calls this mechanism decoupling. So when you decouple your representation of X, where X is any representation at all, the relation between X and the world is put in parentheses. So X may have other properties than it actually has, or you can draw other inferences when it appears. And this is something that occurs in meta-representational contexts. These are contexts in which we represent not the world directly, but other people's representations. Let's see what we mean by this. Suppose that you or someone else, if you don't feel comfortable being this guy, and I don't blame you, are indeed holding a fish. In Leslie's terminology, you have a primary representation to the effect that you are holding a fish. Well, surprisingly, for a primary representation, your internal symbol for fish refers to fishes. And like all primary representations led to roam free in the cognitive system, the representation lends itself to all sorts of inferences, like the representation that I'm holding something that breathes with gills, or that there was fish in the water before I picked up the fish, or that I can make fish do with what I'm holding. But suppose you contemplate this pathetic scenario that Al sees an orca and says and thinks to himself, I see a fish. So you add two new representations to your system. One that to the effect that Al thinks that Al is seeing a fish, and the other one that Al is not seeing a fish, since unlike Al, you know the difference between your fish and your mammals. In a badly designed system, all of these primary representations would be left free to interact promiscuously with each other. In particular, the embedded constituent of belief 1, here in red, would be left to interact with belief 2, thus generating a contradiction. But this is obviously not what happens. Leslie says that when you represent other people's beliefs, given that they might be wrong, you quarantine them from your other primary beliefs. Leslie calls this process decoupling. Indeed, you're treating the quarantine content, the quarantine part of belief 1, set in blue, not as a representation of the world, as belief 2, but as a representation of Al's representation of the world. And so you have a division between your primary representations, which have their normal relations with the world, and meta-representations that are not directly about the world, but about other representations. And as such, they are decoupled from their normal functions and quarantined from other representations.